As David and Will have gone over, Objectivism holds that ethics tells us how to gain and keep the value of our own lives. Since the purpose of ethics is to help you live, you would need it even on a desert island. But the desert island is not a very good place for a human being to live. There are many opportunities to benefit from living in a society with other people, at least as long as it's a society where people can live well. But living well in society has its own challenges, and the objectivist ethics tells us a lot about what we can do to survive, flourish, and be happy when we choose to deal with people. And that is the subject of my lecture today. I'll refer to that subject as social ethics, but I want to be very clear on what I mean by that. It's ethics for the individual in society. And it's for the individual in two senses. First, this is still objectivism, which means it is still egoism. Whatever you should or shouldn't do to benefit others or the government, the ultimate justification must lie in your own good. So the objectivist social ethics is for the individual in the sense that its purpose is to help the individual who practices it live and flourish. Second, this is still ethics, not politics. That means it's for the individual in the sense that its function is to guide the individual, not the government, or whatever that would mean, society as a whole. It tells you what you need to do and be in order to live a flourishing life for yourself. It does not speak, except indirectly, to what legal and political environment is most conducive to your doing that. That's the subject of political philosophy and philosophy of law. So, social ethics. One of the most essential principles of the objectivist social ethics is known as the trader principle. It says that when you gain value from other people, and after all, the whole point of living in society is to gain value from other people, you need to do it by giving value for value in voluntary exchange to mutual advantage. Giving value for value means you don't just mooch, as Rand says. That is, you don't ask people to help you merely on account of your need. When you get help merely because you need it, you're not supporting yourself. You're not living by means of your own actions, which means, since life is a process of self-sustaining action, you're not fully living. You're not exercising the virtue of productiveness. Indeed, if you depend on getting help on account of your need, you give yourself an incentive to make yourself needier instead of more productive, to make yourself worse off rather than try to improve yourself and your situation. Moreover, if you ask people to give you money or other values merely because you need them, you're asking them to give away their resources unwisely, to sacrifice themselves, and that means that the more rational a person is, the less interested he's going to be in helping you. So the very attribute that would make him most able to help you is the one that also makes him most unwilling. Now, some libertarians hold that beggars produce value. After all, giving to a beggar is a voluntary transaction. He's a beggar, not a robber. The giver chose to give money to the beggar, and if he hadn't gotten some value from that, he wouldn't have done it. So evidently, runs the argument, the giver gets pleasure from giving to the beggar, and that pleasure is worth more to him than the money he gives. There are several problems with this analysis. First of all, it rests on the premise that people always act in accordance with their values. But people don't even reliably pursue what they subjectively want. And even when they do gain and keep something they want, sometimes what they want is not objectively valuable. It doesn't contribute to their lives. So we can't even infer that there was a genuine desire to give, let alone a real value. Even if he gets pleasure, that doesn't prove that giving to the beggar produced any actual value for him. Remember, pleasure comes from what you subconsciously take to be good for you, and you could be mistaken. Now, the one respect in which you might actually get some value from this, giving to the beggar, is an experience of your own efficacy. You might see that you have made a difference in his life. But if all he's got is need, your generosity can make only a very limited difference in his life. You can't put a man on his feet if he has no feet. That is, if he doesn't have the ability to go back to taking care of himself. So even that possible small value is very small compared to what you could get helping, say, a valuable friend or a scholarship program or donating to a cause. But beggars aren't the only people you see in the streets asking for money. There are also buskers, people, most commonly musicians, who perform in public places in the hope that those who enjoy their performance will give them money. Now, buskers do give value, or at least they try. They create art, and art can be a real value. What distinguishes buskers from the paradigmatic trader is that you, as the audience member, don't have to give anything except a bit of your attention to the busker to get the value that he's providing. He wants you to give money, but by performing in a public place, he's deliberately giving you the opportunity to listen without paying. So on one hand, you might say, if you give money to a busker, you're not getting anything in return. He's performing where you can hear him, but he would have done that anyway, at least as long as he hoped someone would give him money, or enough people would. And on the other hand, the busker might say, if you enjoy the performance and you don't give me money, you're getting value, or at least pleasure, but you're failing to give me value in exchange. You're free riding both on the busker and on the people who do pay him. So who's right? Well, let's look behind this slogan of value for value. Why do we need to give value for value? One key idea behind the trader principle is life is a process of self-sustaining action. When we give value for value, we produce value to sustain our lives. If the busker's performance helps me sustain my life, and I don't compensate him for that, I haven't produced the value that sustained my life in that respect. I've gotten that value entirely without earning it. On the other hand, if the busker's performance helps sustain my life, and because of it I pay him money that helps him sustain his, then he has produced the value that helps sustain his life. And indirectly, so have I. I've contributed to a culture of paying buskers, and that culture is part of what gave the busker reason to think that if he came out and performed, he'd make money. If this particular busker often performs in a place where I often hear him, I've encouraged him to keep doing it. Mutual consent. So, in a trade, you're not coercing. Coercion stops the other person from acting on his independent judgment in the pursuit of his values. If you coerce, that makes you a threat to be avoided, even if, in this particular case, you're giving the person a genuine value. Even if I make you better off by forcing something on you, I'm a threat to your ability to act on your own independent judgment, which is what you need to do in order to go out and acquire values. And of course, I'm even more of a threat if you didn't benefit, even at the concrete level. Mentioning mutual advantage is as much a matter of emphasis as anything else. Pursuing mutual advantage means treating the other person as the purpose of his own acts, acknowledging that if the trade isn't good for him, he has no reason to consent to it. It also means that you're not just looking for some nominal value to give, but actually enough to make it worth the other person's while to make the trade. But of course, remember, it's ultimately for the other person to judge what's to his advantage. It's the mutual consent element. So why adopt trade as a principle? Well, there's the element of character. You want to develop the skills and the mindset to go through life looking for opportunities for trade, which conflict with the mindset that you would need to go looking for opportunities for predation. It's a question of what are you going to notice and what are you going to habitually do. Now, character, of course, is what you are, but there is also reputation. In this guy's case, not so pleasant, I think you know. This is Adlai Nishka, the businessman from Firefly who likes to torture people who let him down. His theory is that this way people won't dare let him down. And he's got a point. But what he gets wrong, and what Joss Whedon and Tim Minear, the creators of the show, didn't fully take into account, is that if you have a reputation for torturing people who do business with you and perform badly, you give people a very strong reason not to do business with you in the first place. So let's take the trader principle through some different cases. I'll begin with a simple case, a one-off transaction, buying some physical goods. For example, I stopped at a supermarket here in Nashua to pick up a few items for this weekend. Now, there was an exchange of value for value. I gave the supermarket owner some money and he gave me some groceries. Obviously, the owner was not personally present, but simplifying by thinking of it as one person. The transaction was to mutual advantage because having that much food is only useful if you are going to sell it. If people come and shop, you've got a business. If not, you've got a rotten mess. So because of me and people like me, he has money and he's engaged in a business. Mutual consent. He sets his price and I choose to pay it. Now, there is an element of a relationship, potentially, if I expect to go back there, if he expects me to come back there. But that was not the case with the supermarket in Nashua. I don't expect to go there very often, perhaps never again. But what about relationships that are more than just sequences of exchanges of goods for money? Relationships where one person is working for another. Let's start with the case of a professional and his client. An exchange for value for value, sure, the client provides money. The client provides a way for the professional to use his skills to support his life. For example, a lawyer, one hopes, doesn't often represent himself. By having clients, he gets to live by means of the profession of law. On the other hand, the professional is providing services that the client needs, such as legal representation, or to use the example of a profession most familiar to people who have read Rand's novels, the design of a house. Now, mutual advantage has some interesting elements. It's not to my advantage if I work contrary to my own professional values and judgment. It bends my habits in the wrong direction. It doesn't give me the experience of achieving value. And indeed, it's not really to my client's advantage if I don't serve him in accordance with my professional judgment. After all, part of what makes me a professional if I am one, is that I know better than he does about that particular kind of work. For example, if I'm practicing law, I know better than my client what's going to win the case. And yet, it's not rational for my client to consent if he's not convinced that what I propose is in his interest. So getting mutual consent requires either, one, that we agree on the key issues, two, that one of us convince the other so that then we agree on the key issues, or three, that one of us in some sense subordinate his judgment. Now, agreement is fine, convincing the other person is great, but subordinating your judgment raises serious questions about independence and integrity. Now, I don't say that it necessarily sacrifices independence and integrity. Part of what makes a good professional in some contexts is doing what your client wants. Would we say somebody was a good barber if he always cut your hair the way he thought looked best without regard to what you thought looked best? I don't think he'd be a barber who stayed in business. At the same time, a client may have reason to go along with what the professional wants. But each has to judge whether, in the context of his values, the transaction is a good one. And there are many potential transactions that turn out not to be. I'll have more to say about independence and integrity later. Employment can get into similar issues with higher stakes. Walking away from one of many potential clients or from one of many clients that you actually have, is even more so, is not the easiest thing in the world, but it's a lot easier than walking away from a full-time job or risking it by not going along with what your employer wants you to do. Nevertheless, you have to ask yourself, what does it take to make this relationship valuable for me? What does it take to make this relationship to my advantage? There is a popular view that a good employee is willing to make sacrifices for his employer. But sacrifice, giving up what you want, what you value, without getting a greater value in return, is as contrary to the Trader principle here as in any other context. The employee has a long-range interest in the flourishing of the employer and in making sure he contributes to it. That's how he expects to keep his job. That's how he expects both to keep his job in the sense of keeping his employer wanting to employ him and in the sense of keeping his employer in existence so that it can. But while this does give rise to a form of loyalty, the employee is still looking to his own goals by means of his employer. The employee who makes sacrifices expects, quote-unquote makes sacrifices, expects to gain, keep, improve his position within the organization, to ensure that the organization continues to prosper and be able to pay him. Now, if the employee is actually working against his employer's interests, he may not be providing value for value to mutual advantage. And if the employer thinks he's working against the employer's interests, the employer won't continue to consent to the relationship. Now, there's a contrasting view here. The law holds that, at least in certain contexts, the employee must serve only his employer and not himself. But this asks him to drop the context of the whole reason that he would serve his employer in the first place. Similarly, a good employer is said to take care of his employees, and he does. The employer has reason to invest in the employee because, first of all, the employee is free to leave, and also because if the employee stays, the better an employee he is, the more value he can produce for the employer. Now, a lot of the work that I've done has been in nonprofits. The relationship between a nonprofit and its employees is, as far as I've covered employment, similar to the relationship between any other employer and an employee. But the donors and the non-donor beneficiaries bring us interesting new questions. Let's start with the donors. Suppose you're running a nonprofit. In what sense are you exchanging value for value with your donors? Well, there's some value that you want to achieve. That's why you're running a nonprofit in the first place. For example, you might want to promote objectivism or defend constitutional rights. Your donor values that same value. But your donor's busy doing other things, and she can't spend as much time as you can working on. And she doesn't have the same expertise you do. If she wants to achieve this value, her best way of doing it is by giving you money so that you can spend your time on it. You're giving your donor a means of pursuing her values. And to whatever extent your project succeeds, you're providing those values to your donor, which is why donors sometimes tell fundraisers, "Thank you." Moreover, the person who wants your cause to succeed, but who appreciates that it's going to make his life better, but who chooses not to contribute either time or money to any of the organizations pursuing it, is hoping to get something for nothing. He's not acting to gain and keep what he says he values. Now, obviously, the relationship is consensual. You have to convince the donor that the value that you're pursuing is worth pursuing and that your organization is a worthwhile way of pursuing it. Is it to your donor's advantage, this transaction? Well, yes, if you're producing enough real value to be worth the money. If, for example, you set out to make the country freer and you actually are changing policies or actually are producing written work that's likely to have that effect, that's a real value. But it's important for the donor to put it in the context of her overall values and all the other things she needs to do with her money. And what about non-donor beneficiaries? Say, students who come to the Atlas Summit on scholarship. Any of them here? Well, generally, they give the organization a chance to do what it's in business to do. There's not much point in people getting up here and lecturing on objectivism unless there are people listening. And there's not much point in donating money to pay people to lecture on objectivism unless people are listening. But of course, what makes it objectively valuable to have such lectures, to give such lectures, is that it's part of changing the culture for the better. And that ultimately contributes to the lives of the people who are engaging in these various transactions. Now, obviously, I hope we're all here consensually. And if there's a real service being provided, you get the idea, mutual advantage. Friendship. It should be obvious that friendship is consensual. But what are the values that we exchange? Well, I'll run through them fairly quickly. There's material and intellectual assistance, such as favors and advice. There's the opportunity to understand yourself as seen from the outside. There are opportunities for self-expression, including private self-expression. There's the experience of mattering to another person, which makes your own value more perceptible. Now, people talk about friendship as self-sacrificial, but consider this. What good does it tell you about yourself if your friend doesn't think you contribute to her life? Your friend's interest in you is only evidence you're a good person to know if your friend is seeking people who are good to know. Finally, let's consider the case of family. Of all the different kinds of relationships, this is perhaps the one where the conventional wisdom is most inimical to the Trader principle. And conventional wisdom has a point. The conventional family doesn't fit the traitor principle very well. For example, spouses in the modern world entered their marriage contract by mutual consent. We hope because they loved each other. But are they continuing to give value for value? Is that still why they're there? Often, yes. But to the extent that law and culture set up barriers to exit, they may be there because they're unwilling to pay the price of getting out. And if they accept duties to each other, as many people do, if they believe they must stay whether they want to or not, well, I'd say that's against the traitor principle, but actually, that's not even seeking value in the first place. And that's more fundamental. But now, consider the case of minor children. They're not in the relationship by their own consent, usually. They were usually born into it, and they don't have the legal right to leave. Moreover, the conventional view has it that even in particular matters, parents don't need their children's consent. They may, for example, decide to have the pleasure of their child's company on a trip without asking the child. That's seeking value without consent. They demand to be treated with respect on the conventional view and back that demand with threats of punishment. That's seeking value without consent. And it's also dishonest in that it's seeking the experience of being respected without regard to whether the other person actually judges you worthy of respect. And at the same time, one might ask, is the parent getting value for value? The parent usually is, at least in a material sense, providing value to the child. The parent's keeping the child alive, not to mention, if he's a biological parent, he made the child alive, which might have been pleasant if he's the biological father, probably a lot less so in the case of a biological mother. The child usually can't provide nearly the equivalent of material value to what he's getting at the time. And so long as the relationship is involuntary, it can't result in the child owing a debt to the parents. So if the child is giving the parent value, it has to be in something about the experience, perhaps in the way the child sees him, or in the relationship being strong enough that the child will want to be with the parent in his old age. Now, figuring out how to apply the traitor principle constructively in the family context, that is a very difficult challenge on which some work has been done by such people as Will Thomas, and I think some of Rosalind Ross's work offers insights on those points. John Galt says, "We will not deal with men on any terms but ours. And our terms are a moral code which holds that man is an end in himself and not the means to any end of others." And yet the traitor principle is all about treating other people as means to your own ends. I don't go to the grocer in order to keep him in business, but in order to get groceries. I don't talk to my friends just to make them happy, but because I get something out of it. But when Galt says this, he is speaking about what people primarily are. The point is, not that I should not use you for my purposes, or you should not use me, but that we should do so in a way that recognizes that each of us exists for his own sake. And that's what the traitor principle does. When you provide value for value to mutual advantage, you recognize that the other person in his dealings with you needs to act for his own sake. When you deal consensually, you recognize that he needs to be able to do what he judges is best for him. More fundamentally, this is saying that each person's good is ultimately the only sufficient reason for that person to act. So I want to move on to the virtue of honesty. When we seek value from other people's misperceptions, we make their perceptiveness our enemy. When you are trying to avoid being perceived correctly by the other person, you find yourself with a need to undermine the other person's ability to recognize reality, which makes you rather dangerous to that person, a person to be avoided. You need to devote attention to the deception, which means taking your mind off reality. You're giving up visibility. In the case of a relationship where part of what you're looking for is to be seen by the other person, you're not being seen to the extent that you are misleading the person or the other person is misperceiving you. And of course, in order to be misperceived, you need to seek out the imperceptive. They have less to offer, spiritually and materially. And this is bad enough when you're talking about deceiving somebody as to some particular fact. But it is utterly destructive of a relationship where it's about who you are. It's utterly destructive if you are getting value in a particular relationship only because the other person is mistaken about who and what you are. But objectivism is about gaining values, so let's recast this in terms of the values to be gained through honesty. If you are honest, the other person's perceptiveness is not a threat and perhaps even your ally, because the better he sees you, the better for you. You can focus entirely on the reality, not on some deception. You gain visibility. The more you make yourself visible to the other person, the more you have the experience of having who you are recognized. And perhaps the greatest value to be achieved here is being the person that you want to be seen as. If I want to be seen a particular way, there are two things I could do. I could deceive people into thinking I have certain virtues, or I could actually have them and let people see them. If I commit myself to honesty, I rule out the first option, which means that whatever value I expect to gain from other people seeing me as having certain virtues is a strong incentive to help me achieve those virtues. Independence. Reason is a faculty of the individual, even in learning from others. To the extent that you go by somebody else's judgment, you are not acting to sustain yourself. You are not living for yourself. But sometimes there is a lot of informational value to be gained from other people. That, in fact, is one of the things that we choose to live in society for. And we can judge how well another person is likely to know what he's talking about and how likely he is to be telling the truth. And that gives us a sort of second-class independence. If I'm going by your professional judgment, that doesn't mean I know what you know. I don't have direct contact with reality on that point. But I am using my mind to achieve an indirect contact with reality. And that may be the best I can do under the circumstances. I'm saying, well, here's what I know about your knowledge. Here's what I know about your character and your likelihood of telling me the truth to the best of your ability. And based on that, I come to the conclusion that what you are saying must be true. And I have a second-class, indirect contact with reality. Now, this cognitive division of labor allows me to have indirect contact with a lot more of reality than I could have directly. I could have direct contact with. We could draw an analogy to the division of labor in the production of physical goods. I can have a computer by means of writing and earning money to buy a computer. And that gives me a lot more value than I would achieve if I tried to make a computer from scratch. But we have to remember, just as one needs to produce value in order to trade, in order to participate in the division of labor, one still needs to judge for oneself whether the other person is knowledgeable and truthful. And the better you consider that issue, the better you think about it, the better you understand it, the better evidence you gather, and so forth, the better the resulting grasp of reality. This is very much the same as when you're considering the facts directly. Now, a key aspect of integrity is acting on one's own judgment rather than someone else's. Sometimes, however, we may be tempted to act on someone else's judgment, in a sense, to subordinate our own. Now, when is it proper to do that in a philosophy that so emphasizes independence and living for yourself? Well, it is never proper, it is never safe, it is never rational to subordinate your judgment completely. If you're acting on someone else's judgment or preference, you need to make sure that you're doing it because you have judged that it is best to do that. And you need to set the limits within which you will do it. Otherwise, you're in no position to make sure that you're actually pursuing the values you need to sustain yourself. So in a sense, it is never rational to subordinate your own judgment. The other person's judgment is always subordinate to yours if you're dealing with it rationally. Because if you are doing what he says, you're doing it because you see fit to give weight to what he says. Now, sometimes it's more important to do what the other person wants than to do what you think would be best apart from that person's preference. For example, sometimes part of what makes something best is someone else's evaluation. So suppose you are an expert on glasses and glasses frames. Well, you may know a lot about glasses and glasses frames, but part of what makes this pair better for me than that other pair is that I feel like I look like myself in them. Or consider this more difficult case. I'm mildly asthmatic. At one point, my physician proposed to me that I should take a certain medication that had something like a 7% risk of damage to the vocal cords. Or a physician proposed that. Now, from the doctor's perspective, writing me this prescription seems to be the best thing for me. But what do I say when I find out there's this side effect risk? I say, well, actually, I'm somebody who does public speaking and video and enjoys singing, and I'm not willing to run this risk. Now, it could be that I am right in part because of my life's priorities. That is to say that I am right to turn down this medication because, for me, unlike for the typical person, damage to my vocal cords would be especially bad. And that's outside the scope of the doctor's expertise. The doctor doesn't know as well as I do whether running or singing contributes more to my life. And part of what makes it the case that singing contributes more to my life than running is simply that I enjoy singing and I don't much enjoy running. You'll catch me running if I need to catch a bus, maybe. But even if the doctor is objectively right in a particular case, refusing to apply the second best treatment, refusing to write me a prescription for a drug that does not carry that side effect, could lead to ending the relationship. The patient could say, well, I am not going to go along with this. And the patient has the right to act on his mistake. So, is this a case where the doctor ought to go along and write that prescription? Well, if it's something that would help, if it's a pretty good treatment, it would seem so. If it's something that would be no use whatsoever, well, then he would be practicing medicine dishonestly to write that prescription. And then maybe the only thing to do is to allow the relationship to come to an end. And that brings me not so much to the end of this lecture, which I will get to shortly, sorry, but a connection to David's lecture coming up later in the conference, in that a lot of these issues concerning integrity turn out to be difficult questions, questions where arguments can be made on all sides, questions that are really difficult judgment calls. Not, as in many of the questions involving honesty, questions where there really is a clear-cut answer. Sometimes it's a lot less obvious in these issues. Now, rights are the principles that show what terms humans can benefit from living together in society on. Laws have the function of enforcing them and creating an incentive to abide by them, and also the function of giving them clearer definition. So why would you abide by rights and by law? Well, insofar as you're talking about rights upholding laws, you want to be a value rather than a threat. This gets very much into the trader principle. Although being a value rather than a threat, and particularly avoiding being a threat, applies even beyond the context of the trader principle, because it also says, don't go harming other people where you're not seeking value from it, which the trader principle doesn't speak to. Why else obey laws? Well, you want to uphold the value of rights upholding laws. You want to promote a culture where people obey rights upholding laws. One of the most important reasons is you want to, in the case of obeying criminal law, you want to avoid criminal punishment, which would be very detrimental to your life. And you want to do that without undermining the system that you rely on, as you would have to if you tried physically resisting criminal punishment. You want to avoid putting yourself in a situation where you know that the achievement of your values is only possible through a failure of the system you rely on to protect your values. You need to live honestly. The whole opportunity to practice the virtue of honesty is undermined if you violate the law and have to start covering it up. Because then you are seeking value in your relationships while trying to hide important things about what you've done, things that might cause other people to be unwilling to engage in those relationships. And so you are gaining the values of those relationships dishonestly. Now, there are cases where it can be good to disobey the law, particularly unjust laws. There are revolutionary situations. And sometimes it's even rational to disobey the law and accept the punishment that follows. For example, for political purposes, or where the punishment is fairly light and the value to be gained by disobeying is great. Speeding to get somebody to the hospital, for example. Or a reporter going to jail to protect a source. And surely, the question of whether Edward Snowden is a hero or an enemy to all free people is a complicated question that has to be judged by considering the facts, by considering the dangers posed by the NSA, by considering the dangers posed by revealing the information that he revealed, and not just by saying, well, he broke the law. Now, a rights-upholding political order is a value. Rights are a value, having them enforced is a value. And it takes a lot of work to gain and keep that value. It takes resources, it takes judgment. And that is why, as I argued last year at the Atlas Summit, there is a virtue of patriotism, a virtue that says, actually go out and take the actions that are required to create the kind of society in which you can live and flourish. Thank you.
Hello, Alexander. You are extremely okay.
Extremely okay.
Stupendous. How's that? I have a problem with traitor principle in romantic relations and small social contexts with my fellow human beings. I simply think we're better off ignoring it. I think it's too difficult to measure love without the benefit of a good shrink, at least. Children, it's impossible because, as you said, they didn't ask to be born. So you can't ask them to take care of you. You might hope so, but you can't demand that because they didn't ask to be born. You owe them care and education, and you hope it'll be exchanged. I simply think that would cause too many emotional problems. I'd like you to say a few words in response if you were trying to make a point and equate these two things, or how you feel about my point in that it is not useful in personal relationships.
When you say it's not useful, what do you mean? That it does not produce value?
I think it's it's impossible to measure some things. Absolutely, in a business relationship, I fix a tooth and get some money, very clear. But for love, I think you have to be guided by your own inner feelings on if you think things are equal, you're getting something that satisfies you, and not get too hung up on how you're going to measure something.
Nothing in the traitor principle says we have to have a clear-cut measurement in the kind of sense in which it's helpful to have a measurement to know, how much these bananas are worth. What it says is that it has to actually be to each party's interest. That has to be why they're there. That you're actually benefiting from these personal relationships, that you're in them consensually for the sake of that benefit. And the other person is in there for the sake of the benefit that he or she is getting.
Okay, I'll take that as a good point, in that your price or whatever is negotiable, that nothing has a fixed intrinsic value, if that's what you mean.
Well, it's not just that it doesn't have a fixed intrinsic value, it's that the question is not, gee, how much is my relationship with my friend worth, in the sense that you want to fix a number to it. It's, is this relationship worth the time and energy and perhaps other resources that I am putting into it? Would I be better off choosing to end it or scale it back? And now, is there measurement involved? Yes, there's measurement. But it's not measurement reduced to cardinal numeric values. It's not, well, this relationship is worth 20 points. It's this relationship that I have with a friend that I talk to every week or two about politics for an hour on the phone. Yeah, I get enough out of that relationship that it's worth spending an hour on the phone with him talking about politics. This relationship with somebody who's my close friend that I'm constantly interacting with on Facebook, with messages back and forth practically every day. Well, I get insights and I get various experiences of efficacy, and I get somebody I can talk to about all manner of issues in my life and get the experience of discussing them and get often useful responses, and I can get various emotional things. I know she's there for me in various ways, and okay, here's value. And it's not, well, that relationship is worth 20 times as much as the other. It's, these are activities, these are relationships that are ultimately in my interest to keep up with and to keep doing. And in pursuing these relationships, I'm making sure that the other person also is getting value and is also benefiting from it, so that he or she wants to continue the relationship. Because I recognize that we're interacting by consent.